You've grown older. You've built a life, overcome hardship, maybe even raised children or held grandchildren in your arms. But in the quiet moments, when no one is watching, when the world pauses, something inside you still aches. It's a kind of sadness that doesn't have a name, a hollow space that no achievement seems to fill. And just when you think you've moved on, it resurfaces, like a whisper from the past, soft but persistent, a fragment of memory, a buried feeling, something unfinished. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, once said, "What is not brought to consciousness returns as fate." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He meant that the unresolved emotions we leave buried deep within ourselves don't just disappear. They reappear, shaping our decisions, our reactions, our relationships. They become the hidden architects of our lives. And among these buried emotions, one of the deepest, and most often ignored, comes from our relationship with our mothers. Maybe your mother was physically present, but emotionally unavailable. Maybe she was affectionate, or maybe she was distant, critical, unpredictable. Maybe you've told yourself you've forgiven her. You've grown up, you've matured, you've moved on. But your unconscious has a different story. The human mind, especially the unconscious, doesn't operate on linear time. It doesn't forget just because years have passed. What was felt, but never fully understood, gets stored in the body and soul. And that's why, even decades later, so many adults walk through life still carrying the invisible weight of childhood pain. They fear disappointing others. They struggle to assert themselves. They crave validation, especially from women, especially from authority figures. The pain is subtle, but the pattern is loud. This repeating pain often stems from one cruel and simple truth. The mother was not who the child needed her to be. Perhaps she did her best. Perhaps she was overworked, emotionally wounded, or never shown love herself. Maybe she was surviving more than living. But for the child, none of this changes the experience of longing for something that never arrived. The gaze that reassures, the voice that protects, the gesture that says, "You are enough, just as you are." Freud believed that true emotional healing only begins when we are able to recognize the symbolic origin of our suffering. This doesn't mean blaming. It means seeing clearly. It means learning to look at the image of your mother, not with bitterness or blind loyalty, but with emotional honesty. It means realizing how this first bond, the first mirror we ever knew, shaped how we love, how we trust, how we guard ourselves, how we exist. And that bond is more powerful than most of us realize. The mother is our first source of love, and often our first source of pain. She is the face we search for in a crowd before we know what a crowd is, the voice we recognize before we even have language, the presence we crave, not by choice, but by instinct. She is the first definition of the world we understand. When that presence is nurturing, we grow rooted in safety. When it's conditional, cold, or inconsistent, we grow with questions written into our skin. Children don't have the mental tools to separate what their caregivers did from who they are. So when a child feels ignored or unloved, the conclusion is rarely, "Something is wrong with her." It's almost always, "Something is wrong with me." That belief doesn't vanish when we get older. It hides inside us, influencing how we see ourselves and how we let others treat us. Many grown men and women carry this wound without ever realizing it. They become adults who seek endless approval from partners, bosses, friends. They fear being wrong. They avoid setting boundaries. And when they are criticized, they react with pain that feels larger than the moment, as if someone just tore open an old scar. This overreaction isn't just emotional. It's biological. Trauma rewires the nervous system. A raised voice can feel like danger. A disapproving glance can bring shame. And the worst part? Most of us don't even know where it started. We just live in the reaction. The root often lies in the early dynamic with the mother, a relationship that should have been a safe haven, but became a battlefield of unmet needs. Freud taught that the unconscious stores these imprints, even when our conscious minds forget or downplay them. And unless we face these early patterns, we are doomed to repeat them. If your mother was controlling, you may now attract partners who suffocate you. If she was emotionally absent, you might fall for people who seem distant or cold. Your adult relationships become a reenactment, a subconscious effort to fix what couldn't be fixed back then. But it never works, because it's not really about the other person. It's about the ghost of an old hope still haunting your heart. The wounded inner child continues the quest. This time, maybe I'll be loved right. And the adult stays stuck, repeating patterns that limit, frustrate, and confuse. The first step in healing is recognizing the pattern, not to judge, but to understand. When you stop idealizing or demonizing your mother, you begin to reclaim the power she once had over your identity. And in that space, something miraculous happens. You stop being just a child seeking to be seen and start becoming the adult who sees themselves. This isn't about guilt, it's about freedom. And freedom always begins with awareness. As children, we don't just learn language or how to walk. We absorb emotion, behavior, and the silent codes of love and fear. We study our caregivers, not through books, but through their touch, tone, absence, or gaze. And the one who teaches us the most, often without saying a word, is the mother. In the early years, the mother is everything. She is the world. Her arms are the first shelter. Her presence is the first proof that we exist. So, when her love is unpredictable, when her approval feels conditional, or when her attention comes only when we perform, something within the child begins to twist. The foundation that should be built on secure affection is instead built on negotiation, shame, or silent anxiety. A child can't say, "My mother is emotionally inconsistent," but they can feel it, viscerally. When the child reaches out and finds no response, they internalize the message. Maybe I'm not worth responding to. This becomes the invisible script written into the nervous system. A script that gets played out not just in childhood, but in adult relationships, careers, and even parenting. Freud emphasized that the unconscious is timeless. It doesn't care whether a memory happened 5 decades ago or 5 days ago. If it was never processed, it remains active, like a loop running in the background. We don't just remember pain, we embody it. Adults often live under the illusion that their behavior is based on present-day choices. But in reality, many of their reactions are echoes of old wounds. They flinch when someone raises their voice. They crumble under disapproval. They feel paralyzed when asked to speak their truth. What looks like insecurity or indecisiveness is often the aftershock of a childhood where expressing oneself meant risking rejection. For some, this inherited emotional pattern shows up in their careers. They become perfectionists, terrified of making mistakes. Not because they are overly ambitious, but because they once learned that failure equals loss of love. They need validation like oxygen and live in fear of criticism. Every workplace becomes another playground where old dynamics replay, with the boss taking the place of the mother, the performance review triggering childhood shame. In romantic relationships, the pattern can be even more vivid. A woman whose mother was emotionally unavailable might find herself attracted to men who are distant, inattentive, or cold. At first, the chase feels thrilling. Maybe this time, I'll be enough. But eventually, the same loneliness returns. Not because of the partner, but because of the ancient emptiness she's trying to fill. The tragedy is not in the repetition itself. It's in the blindness to it. Most people aren't aware that they're repeating. They just think, "I always choose the wrong person," or "Why am I so afraid of speaking up?" But these aren't random traits. They're inherited emotional strategies, crafted in a childhood where survival depended on adaptation. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, an unconscious drive to relive early emotional traumas in the hope of mastering them. But without awareness, the repetition becomes a trap, not a path to healing. If your mother was unpredictable, you might find stability suspicious. If she was overly involved, you might crave distance, but fear loneliness. If she was cold, you may hunger for warmth, but sabotage it when it arrives. These are not personality quirks. They are strategies of the wounded child still trying to solve a puzzle that never had all its pieces. And then there is guilt. Not the guilt of doing something wrong, but the guilt of wanting something different. The guilt of drawing boundaries. The guilt of choosing yourself. It's a guilt that whispers, "If you change, you're betraying her." This is especially strong for those raised by mothers who were emotionally dependent, controlling, or overly self-sacrificing. These mothers often gave everything, except space to grow. They loved, but with conditions. They helped, but with expectations. They protected, but at the cost of autonomy. And so the child grows into an adult who doesn't know how to separate, who feels like having needs is selfish, and saying no is cruel. This internal conflict becomes a life theme. These adults constantly monitor others' emotions, afraid to upset or disappoint. They suppress their truth, always prioritizing others. And when they do try to step away or speak up, they're hit by a wave of shame, as if daring to be themselves is an act of violence. What Freud discovered is that this guilt isn't moral. It's psychological. It's not about right or wrong. It's about loyalty, a misplaced loyalty to a role you never chose but couldn't refuse. The role of the emotional caretaker, the pleaser, the silent one. And that role, when held too long, begins to suffocate the adult who longs to breathe. Breaking free doesn't mean cutting ties. It means shifting positions. It means moving from child to adult, from one who needs to please to one who needs to live. It means understanding that love doesn't require the loss of self, that you can honor your past without being held hostage by it, that setting boundaries isn't betrayal, it's healing, it's hard, it feels unnatural, because the old role is comfortable, even if it's painful. The known, even when it hurts, feels safer than the unknown. But growth always begins at the edge of discomfort, and healing always begins with truth. When you see that the guilt you carry is not yours, that it was passed down, taught, expected, you begin to release it, not all at once, but slowly. You breathe deeper. You speak softer to yourself. You stop apologizing for being human. You stop trying to be the perfect child. And you start becoming a full person. And in doing so, you give your mother what she never knew how to give herself, permission to be imperfect and still be loved. That is the paradox of healing. We begin by facing our pain, but we end by finding compassion for ourselves and even for those who hurt us. The past doesn't vanish, but it stops running the show. There are mothers who love their children deeply, but only as long as those children reflect what they want to see. Their affection feels warm, but it isn't free. Their support exists, but only within specific, unspoken rules. To the outside world, these mothers may appear devoted, but inside the child, confusion brews. Why do I feel so anxious, so never enough, when I'm being loved? Freud paid particular attention to this kind of relationship. He observed that some mothers, especially those emotionally wounded or lacking in self-identity, treat their children not as separate beings, but as extensions of themselves. In psychology, we often refer to them as narcissistic mothers, not in the sense of vanity, but in their inability to see the child as someone independent, someone allowed to fail, to choose, to exist freely. For these mothers, the child is not a gift to guide, but a project to control. They unconsciously assign meaning to the child's existence. Your success is my redemption. Your behavior is my reputation. Your happiness should reflect mine. And when the child begins to show signs of individuality, likes and dislikes, independence, defiance, affection may be withdrawn, approval becomes conditional, love becomes a transaction. To survive this, the child adapts. They suppress what's inconvenient. They become hyper-attuned to their mother's moods. They learn to anticipate reactions, to smile when they're sad, to achieve when they're exhausted. And slowly, they start to believe that their worth is something to be earned, not something they inherently possess. This distortion becomes a blueprint for adulthood. These children often grow into high-functioning, but internally fractured adults. They become people who look capable, who appear put together, but inside they are haunted by a chronic sense of inadequacy. They chase achievements, but can't enjoy them. They seek approval, but distrust it. They fear failure, not for what it is, but for what it means, the loss of love. In relationships, they tend to attract partners who echo the emotional dynamic they once knew. Partners who are distant, critical, or controlling. Subconsciously, they're reenacting a familiar story. If I can finally be enough for this person, maybe it will fix what my mother never saw in me. But it doesn't fix it, because the original wound was never about the current partner. It was about a child trying to earn love in a world where love was conditional. One of the most painful symptoms of this kind of upbringing is the internalized voice, a relentless inner critic that sounds like your own thoughts, but carries the tone of your mother's disapproval. You're lazy. You're not trying hard enough. You'll disappoint everyone. This voice is not your conscience. It's a recording of childhood, played back over and over until it becomes your identity. Freud referred to this as the development of the superego, the internal authority that reflects parental expectations. When the mother is overly strict, emotionally manipulative, or shaming, the superego becomes a tyrant. It punishes not only mistakes, but desires. It transforms the most basic needs, rest, joy, self-care, into guilty indulgences, And so, the adult learns to live in a state of constant tension. Even when they do everything right, they feel wrong. Even when others praise them, they doubt it. Because deep inside, a part of them still believes they are only lovable when they perform, when they conform, when they disappear. This leads to emotional exhaustion, burnout, anxiety, people-pleasing, overworking, self-sabotage, an inability to receive love or success without feeling like an imposter. The irony is devastating. These are often the most kind, compassionate, and generous individuals, yet they can't extend that same compassion to themselves. They live under an invisible rule book. Don't make waves, don't disappoint, don't rest, don't be too much, don't be too little. Just be exactly what others need, always. Freud's insight was clear. This is not a personality flaw. It's a learned defense, a survival strategy, and it can be unlearned. But to unlearn it, we must first recognize it. We must be brave enough to admit, my mother wasn't the ideal figure I was taught to worship. This doesn't mean you hate her. It doesn't mean you reject everything she gave. It means you allow yourself to see the full picture, the nurturing and the neglect, the care and the control, the love and the loss. This clarity is not an attack. It is liberation. Because once you name the distortion, you can begin to rebuild your identity outside of it. You can stop living for the approval of someone who never learned to approve of herself. You can choose rest without guilt. Speak honestly without fear. Set boundaries without shaking, and slowly that critical voice, so long mistaken for your own, begins to quiet. You start to recognize when it speaks. You begin to talk back. You tell yourself what you always needed to hear. You are enough. Even now, even without achieving anything today, you are enough. This is how healing begins. Not in dramatic moments of forgiveness or confrontation, but in the quiet rewiring of your relationship with yourself. You learn that love doesn't have to be earned, that care doesn't require sacrifice, that your worth was never up for debate. And the most beautiful part? As you begin to change your relationship with yourself, everything around you begins to shift. You stop tolerating disrespect. You stop chasing approval. You start choosing relationships that reflect your new sense of value. This is not easy. The old patterns will fight back. The inner critic will scream louder before it fades. But every time you choose truth over guilt, presence over performance, love over fear, you weaken the chains of childhood programming. You don't need to prove anything anymore. You just need to be. And for the first time, that's finally enough. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. People think it means reconciliation, that it requires an apology, a hug, or a conversation. But Freud taught us something more profound, something quieter, and often lonelier. True forgiveness is an internal act. It doesn't require anyone else to be present. It begins the moment you stop carrying the weight of someone else's limitations as your own, especially when that someone is your mother. Many adult children wait their entire lives for a moment that may never come. A mother's apology, an honest acknowledgement, a simple, "I'm sorry I couldn't be what you needed." But that moment rarely arrives. And as time passes, so does the illusion that healing must come from her. Freud warned that such hope often keeps us emotionally frozen, children waiting for a correction in a story that already ended. Real healing begins when you stop needing the story to change and start rewriting what it means for you. The image of the mother lives not only in photographs or memories, but deep in the unconscious. She becomes a symbol of love, safety, rejection, fear, expectation. And unless we consciously untangle that symbol, it controls how we see ourselves, how we move in the world, and how we relate to others. That's why even at 50, 60, or 70 years old, many people suddenly realize they are still not free. They've built careers, families, entire lives, but they're still living with an emotional contract signed in childhood. I exist to make you happy. And every attempt to assert independence feels like betrayal. But there's another way. Emotional separation doesn't mean coldness. It doesn't mean abandonment or cruelty. It means recognizing that your life is your own. It means allowing your mother to be who she is, flawed, human, limited, without letting that define your worth. It means saying, I love you, but I also love myself, and I no longer need to disappear to be close to you. For some, this realization is slow. It comes not with a shout, but with a whisper, a moment of clarity after decades of emotional confusion, a deep exhale after a lifetime of holding your breath. It may look like declining a phone call without guilt, saying no without apology, letting go of the need to explain your every choice. And in these small acts, something sacred begins to unfold. you reclaim your selfhood. Freud called this psychic autonomy, the foundation of true mental health. It is the capacity to live by your own internal compass, rather than the inherited expectations of a wounded parent. It is not selfish, it is sanity. And yet, the guilt doesn't vanish overnight. It rises, disguised as loyalty, as gratitude, as fear. How can I walk away from the woman who raised me? But Freud would gently remind you, walking away doesn't always mean leaving. Sometimes it means turning inward, away from her voice in your head and toward your own. There are mothers who, for reasons buried in their own unmet needs, cannot allow their children to grow up. They hover, interfere, question every decision. They call this love. But often it's fear in disguise, fear of losing relevance, fear of being alone, fear of facing their own reflection without you standing in front of it. When a child grows up under such a shadow, independence feels like rebellion. Every step toward freedom feels like a betrayal. But the truth is this: no child should have to sacrifice themselves to preserve someone else's sense of self. Love that demands self-erasure is not love. It is a burden, and over time it becomes a sickness. Breaking free from this dynamic doesn't require a dramatic confrontation. It doesn't demand harsh words. It requires courage, the quiet kind, the kind that lets you say, I am allowed to exist, even when it makes you uncomfortable. I am allowed to live a life that is not yours. This shift doesn't just free the child. In a way, it frees the mother too, because when the child steps out of the role of emotional caretaker, the mother is left with herself. She may resist, she may panic, but she is also given a mirror. And in that mirror, if she chooses to look, she may finally see her own wounds, not through the projection onto her child, but in raw honesty. But even if she never sees it, you still have the power to heal. Freud believed that the unconscious can be re-educated, that old patterns, once made conscious, can be slowly dismantled. It begins with a question: why do I still feel guilty for living my own life? From there, the path opens. You stop asking, will she be okay if I do this? And start asking, will I be okay if I don't? You stop needing to justify your boundaries. You stop fearing your voice. You begin to write a new script, one where you are not just a child reacting to the past, but an adult shaping the future. This doesn't mean you stop loving her. It means you stop losing yourself in the name of love. You can call, you can visit, you can care, but you do it from a place of choice, not obligation. And if the relationship is too painful to maintain, you are allowed to step back. That, too, is love, the kind that protects both of you from roles that were never fair. And somewhere along the way, something extraordinary happens. You look in the mirror and see someone new, not the daughter she wanted, not the son she needed, but a full person, whole, flawed, free. You realize that your value was never dependent on being good enough for her. It was always yours, waiting for you to reclaim it. This is what Freud meant when he said that the past must stop ruling the present. The moment you make that decision, not in rage, but in clarity, the healing begins. You may still feel pain, you may still feel longing, but you're no longer owned by them, and that is liberation. You've come this far. You've carried stories that were not yours. You've survived a kind of silence that most people never speak of, and now, you have a choice, not to forget, not to hate, but to live, fully, authentically, as the adult your younger self always needed. You may not receive the apology, but you can give yourself the permission. You may not get the validation, but you can offer yourself the peace. You may not change the past, but you can stop it from defining the next chapter. And that is the most powerful reconciliation of all, not with her, but with yourself. You are enough. You always were.